So while you're joining, just drop in the chat your name and where you're from, what school affiliation, so we can know who's joining us in the room. And we're so excited that you're here with us to have Math Power Hour, where we really talk about the standards and conceptualizing this big M, because there's lots of conversation as to what is this big M. And our goal is to not just understand it, but be able to enact upon it and utilize it. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ruthmae Sears, and I'm an associate professor for mathematics education at the University of South Florida. And I'm truly excited to co-facilitate this session with my wonderful colleagues and friends, Dr. Sandra Vernon-Jackson and Ms. Beth Smith, who represents Texas Instrument. And so we are truly excited as a collective to really reflect on the B.E.S.T standards. And we use the term big M as documented in the standards document, but they actually use the number 1 rather than the letter I. And I thought that was kind of cool because we are number 1 in the state of Florida. Florida is a phenomenal place. But the goal is not just to amplify the big M, but to promote pathways to success, because that was a question that came up last time during our conversation as to what's next. And our goal as educators is to ensure all of our students achieve and succeed, and also have opportunities to excel regardless of the pathways that they pursue. Next slide, please. All right. Yes. So for this presentation, we will be discussing what is the big M, reflecting on benchmarks, because that's important for the state, and then connecting the benchmarks and horizontal alignments, as well as the vertical alignments. And then really realizing that many of the documents also provide terms from the K-12 glossary and instructional strategies. And then we're going to think about the common misconceptions, and subsequently, think about the progressions by strand and pathways to success, because that's important. We acknowledge technological tools that will be used, and also we'll share the links to the statewide math meeting, leaders meeting, because that can also be helpful as you move forward. Now, and we realize by sharing resources is how we're going to grow as a community to really support this space. Next slide, please. So when you look at the progression for the state standards, you'd realize we all start off with this construct of measurement, fractions, number sense, and algebraic reasoning. However, as they reach into high school, we start to go towards functions, financial literacy, trigonometry, logic and theory, and calculus. However, the foundation is critical. Now, over the past 2 years, actually, we've had challenges with COVID-19 relative to learning losses. And there are many programs that have been used, we call it learning remediation, and also learning support systems to bridge the gap. And so this is where, as we think about the learning trajectory, the progression, we have to also think about how do we develop the mathematical thinking and reasoning standards. And so the document actually have 7 mathematics thinking and reasoning standards, from actively participating in effortful learning, both individually and collectively, demonstrating an understanding by representing problems in multiple ways, complete tasks with mathematical fluency, engage in discussions that reflect on the mathematical thinking of self and others, use pattern and structure to help understand and connect mathematical concepts, assess the reasonable solution, and apply mathematics to real world solutions. Now, when you read these documents, you'd realize, unlike before, a lot of stuff was left to interpretation, but the representatives from the state have done a phenomenal job in trying to explicate what do they mean. So in their case, they would have tried to quote unquote unpack it. But when I use the word unpack, I talk from the lens of the Math Knowledge for Teaching by Deborah Ball, where we try to make sense of it for our meaning and our perspective, because the document provides a guide. And as a collective, we have to think about, what does it mean for our practice? What changes, if any, needs to be made to the instruction to ensure we meet the students' need, as well as support learning losses that might have occurred. Next slide, please. And so the best instructional practice is really where we define the big M. And this is important because this language is in the document. And so the instructional support document, it is wonderful. It's the big M. So they put a number 1 in the middle. They don't put the I, and that's important. So when we say the big M, we're talking about it's intended to assist educators with planning for student learning and instruction to align with the benchmark for excellence in student thinking. So the Big M is an abbreviation for Best Instructional Guide. It's an abbreviation for Best Instructional Guide. And that's so critical. This guide is designed to aid high quality instruction through the identification of components that support the learning and teaching. And the Big M includes an analysis of information related to the B.E.S.T standards. And the document is posted on the B.E.S.T webpage. And so what we encourage educators to do is to first look at what is in this document. What changes are they explicitly stating were made to a particular grade level? Now, I'm always interested in Algebra 1 because it's a common course that many students take. So thinking about what they said was added, but also what was moved to other groups, be it the honors or in a future class. And so the Big M provides clear guidance as to what changes were made and also things the teachers should attend to. And so here, when we think about it, I'm going to drop in the chat the benchmark for point. So here you go. So in the chat, I'm dropping, that is actually the document for the Big M. And so the state of Florida kind of gives an overview of what it means. And so the benchmarks are the key part, because when I think about guidelines for curriculum, what is the indicator affects what actually happens in that space. And so the benchmark refers to what is the foci of the mathematics. And so it has related clarifications. The 912 benchmark may include multiple courses, and they also clarify what is intended for that space. Now, for this presentation, we're going to continuously look at a benchmark focusing on fitting a linear function. And so we're going to fit a linear function to bivariate numerical data that suggests a linear association and interpret the slope and y-intercept of the model, use the model to solve real world in the context of the data. So the benchmark clarification, they're clarifying exactly what do they mean by that? Because too often we use words and it could have multiple interpretation, particularly what textbook you're using. And they're saying where you're looking at including fitting a linear function and making a prediction or extrapolation inside and outside of the range of the data based on the line of best fit. Now this is important because as you think about what is written, you have to reflect on what resources are you using to meet these standards? To what extent do you need to modify your current practices to ensure it's aligning with the clarification that is being given as to the expectations? Next slide, please. And so this is why I'm always cautious and very sensitive to educators. And I encourage you to really remember the implication of the written curriculum, what we call the official curriculum. Because the official curriculum, it influences your teacher's intended curriculum, the enacted curriculum, and ultimately student outcomes. And this was documented in the visual model that was published by Remillard and Heck in 2014. And so when you think about those benchmarks, that's going to guide some of the actions that we think adhere to. And the Big M specifies exactly certain things that should be addressed. And so as educators, we have to really think about, if this is given to us in the written, what changes do we need to make in our enacted practice and our intended curriculum to really ensure it's enacted as intended or envisioned? Next slide, please. So at this time, I refer to my wonderful colleague, Dr. Sandra Vernon-Jackson.
So good evening, everyone. And again, welcome. I am so excited. I'm more excited to see students. I'm sorry, colleagues, but just seeing those individuals who are coming through the pipeline, who will be in our classrooms coming up soon, makes me feel great. So I have a question. What comes to mind when you hear the phrase horizontal alignment and vertical alignment? So if you could just drop thoughts in the chat, I'm going to give you a few minutes to do so. That's horizontal alignment and vertical alignment.
Right. So Morgan noted it's a horizontal alignment is the progression within the grade level, and Patty said through the grade level. Whereas as it relates to vertical alignment, Cherry said vertical alignment would be from one grade to the next and above. Or Holly noted it spends a little time on a subject each year. And Linda said where students have been and where they need to go, both in current grade and within grades. So that's what they suggested in the chat.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your contributions. So, I don't like to go back and do exactly what people said because it seems like you all got it. So absolutely, the idea of horizontal alignment, dealing with, your intentional progression within, right, the same grade level, while horizontal from the grade that you are, the previous grade, and where your intent is. What I want to make sure we say is that this is about conceptual understanding in mathematics and fluency. As you look at the mathematical thinking reasoning that Dr. Sears showed earlier on, it showed you these reasoning that we want our students to be able to have, and that allows them to internally assess their particular experiences in the math class. So if you think back, sometimes we want our students to think about how or assess how they are engaged in doing mathematics. So keep that in the forefront as we go to the next slide and start looking at these different alignments. So again, we're using a 9 through 12 standard in algebra. And what I'd love to do, since some of us here on the call are at the elementary level, think in terms of, when you look at the standard there, think in terms of what exactly in mathematics do you think you have done in the elementary level that can support this particular standard, right? So we talked about the line of best fit. Now, the horizontal standard, if you look to the left there, it gives you the definition, is connecting benchmark, right, that either make mathematical connection or include prerequisite skills. We want to be able to focus specifically on the content, but making sure that we are attending to fluency for students. They need to get this while we're there. So I'm going to put out a question real quick. As you look particularly at this standard, line of best fit, think of, at the elementary level, is there anything that you are engaged in that will support this particular standard coming through? And if you could just drop some ideas in the chat. So within the same grade level, you're given set of data, selecting an appropriate method, right? So students have to be able to also interpret the data. Now, at the elementary level, is there anything that you will be doing that contributes to this particular standard? That is also important. So yes, you are building the foundational skills for our students through this. Any thoughts and ideas as we go to the next slide? Please do not hesitate, if you can, to kind of open your mic and make suggestions as well.
Okay, so Beth made a note, determine the type of data, categorical and numerical, is potential ways to build into this space.
Absolutely, absolutely. It is important that at that level that you think about how you're supporting these algebraic benchmarks as students are coming through. Now, the vertical alignment for this, as you all talked about the vertical alignment early on, what you did previously in 8th grade as you think forth, and then what the students will do following into the next benchmark. And as you can see, if you look at those 8th grade standards, right, given a set of real world numerical data, construct a scatter plot, a line graph, all these are the supporting piece that really supports this particular benchmark. And then having students to move forward to be able to do exponential functions and data later on as they go through their vertical alignment. Remember, this is built in to make sure students are having conceptual knowledge of the mathematics and fluency, and that is very, very important as we move forward. Strong alignment to standards are cohesive, and it allows for clarity as students learn the mathematics. So that is one of the reasons why in the big M, right, this is also laid out for us as educators so that we too can see exactly where students are coming from at the end of the benchmark, what they should be able to do as they're moving into the different grade levels or onto the next benchmark. Next slide, please. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate. So in this particular here, in the big M, what I liked with this document is that it pointed out a lot of information for us. I want to make sure the terms that they're emphasizing here for us to utilize in this particular benchmark is not the exclusive list. There's so many other terms that if you think of this particular benchmark, students are going to be or have to be aware of, right? So think of, again, especially at the elementary level. I think Beth talked about specific data that, or the different types of data that students have to be able to differentiate between, right? And also the knowing of maybe linear functions coming through at the 8th grade level. Benchmark and I always say the common language of mathematics. That also helps our students with the conceptual knowledge when we start using those mathematical language consistently as we teach.
And I want to piggyback off this because this is why it's so critical to have a conception of the vertical as well as horizontal alignment. Because as you think about what words were they were introduced before, we can use it to promote cyclic reasoning and cyclic review of content. So we're constantly going over the conversation by using the language that was introduced in their 8th grade or 7th grade or even 6th grade, where we make connections. Because letting them see the beauty of mathematics and how mathematics is connected, that have so much value as well. So this is why it's important to read the document, not just for the grade you're teaching, but what was the objectives before that course? And then looking at what were the things that they explicitly said it'll match to, but also what are other information? Because this is where acknowledging the terms are not exhaustive, but really thinking about what is the vocabulary you want to introduce them to and or review while you're engaging in this conversation. That is so critical. So at this point, it's so important because now that we have these standards, we acknowledge those vertical alignments, the horizontal alignments, and the benchmark. But the question is, what do we do? And I think this is what got my attention as I was reviewing the document in its entirety relative to what are the instructional strategies that are being emphasized and addressed. And I think it's very important because they're helping us to think about how to enact the mathematics. So we acknowledge that each class is different because people are different, but they're telling us particular strategies to help students to really engage in the mathematics that's being discussed. And this is why I think the focus is on the big M itself, like really thinking about what part should be amplified. And so we think about the line of best fit. They made a comment relative to having students work with bivariate data or engage in plotting, review with students that are scatter plot as a display of numerical data, good for showing relationship or association. And students are fitting a line and instruction, use technology. And I'm always a fan of technology, but really thinking about explicit guidance as to things to consider to meet that objective. And that to me is notable because at this point, we're no longer just guessing as to what is, but we're thinking about what are practices that can help support the understanding, students developing a conceptual understanding of this construct. And so the instructional strategy is really aligns with the benchmark, and it includes the explanations, the details for the benchmark, the vocabulary, and strategies that can actually support this, as well as the math thinking and reasoning standards. And that is important that because we think about the content standards, we have to also think about how do we develop those processes and practices that we want students to amplify as well. And the document provided specific examples to really address the MTRs. And so I think by really going through them, really thinking about this is how they're thinking about the mathematics. Now, how do I break that to my classroom? What part would I amplify? How will I use my time? How will I structure my instruction? You know, where would I have time for student engagement? What technology will be used? Because technology have evolved so much within the past 2 years. Thanks to COVID, we have so much variety to choose from Desmos to CPOMs. There is many tools outlined that's available to help support mathematical learning. Or even how do you explore this construct, or even TI. TI is phenomenal for many resources. So they gave us not just the tools, but they gave us guidance as to the things that should be happening during that instructional practice itself to achieve that benchmark. And that is something as educators, it's important to review what is being amplified and what is being suggested that needs to be attended to. Next slide, please.
Dr. Sears, can I make a quick do a quick comment? So just going back to the mathematical thinking and reasoning, I was in a meeting earlier on, and actually last week, and someone says, you know, the mathematical shifts that we had in the math practices were so good. And they asked, did those just disappear and go away because we're no longer thinking about the Math Florida standard? And the point was made that the mathematical thinking and reasoning was actually built from the math practices. And if you look at them, you could see how they closely correlate or link together. And the suggestion was allow students to use this as a way to assess themselves. And I thought that was so important to make sure, because so many times we as teachers, right, we do all the assessing and not allowing students to take the responsibility, give them, you know, them as the agency of their own learning. And I think that is something important to think about as you look at those 7 standards that are pointed for the mathematical thinking and reasoning. And I think this is my cue. So CPOM is now available. And for anyone that is at a district that is or does not have access to CPOM, I will put in the chat the contact information that you can reach out to at CPOMs to help you, or you could simply go on cpom.org and hit that help button and put in your email address, and they promise that someone will get back to you within 2 days. So I was very, very happy to hear that. However, at the university and college level, your instructors will, or your whatever program you're in, your particular instructors and or professors will give you or allow you through some type of registration access into CPOM, so you have access to all of the resources and all of the materials that are there. And if you need more information, I'll be happy to share it later on. But definitely, if you don't have access to CPOM right now, you can and it's up and running. I was told today they're up, they've tested it, and it's ready to go. So you can go ahead and start utilizing it. If you're with a particular school district, all school districts in the state of Florida are right now, they have been embedded with the district, and it is up and running. For those at the college level, your professors will give you access to that. Okay.
Thank you. And another thing they also embed in the big M is this misconception. Now, what's fascinating with the construct of misconception, it is a conception with an error. So they are making connections. However, the schemas that they're connecting may be at fault. And so in this regard, the document actually identify areas where students may be getting it wrong, or misconception or potential errors that they face. And so, for example, with the content relative to the fit of a linear function, they acknowledge students may confuse the two variables when interpreting the data, or students may know the difference, may not know the difference between interpolation and extrapolation. And this is important because when we think about this, if you know where students are having the error, you can plan to address it. We call it disrupt the error or disrupt the misconception and say, hey, there is something wrong with this argument. What can they do about it? And so if the student thought that was their answer and you're telling them something is wrong, you're creating a moment for reflection. And so really thinking about how do you use this information of potential errors to help educate and elevate the students and empower them to say, let's try another approach. Let's think about what is the key idea. And so being cognizant and using carefully planning to address the misconception in your planning, that is so valuable. Next slide, please. And so here, the instructional task. So at this time, I think, so when we think about instructional tasks, even if you weren't sure about what to do, they even gave you examples of a task that is suitable to meet that particular benchmark. And so that helps you to draw on resources. So although we use textbook to help inform our curriculum, so the textbook is a written curriculum, they're giving you specific exemplars to help you think about what do they mean in this space. And so you can actually use these tasks to help inform your practice or consider something that mirrors the ideals in which the idea was going to be addressed. So really thinking about what is the it and how could you ensure the objective was met? And so the nature of the task and the task actually have varying levels of cognitive demand. And that's important because our goal is to develop students who are critical thinkers and can engage in doing mathematics. And another thing I am also fascinating with the task, they had lots of real world tasks, and that's important, or tasks that was situated within the real world setting. And so really thinking about how do we draw on this information or use those tasks to help center the instruction, because it creates an opportunity for us to think about our interpretation, but what are students doing with these exemplar tasks, and to what extent are their responses varying? So it could even be used to help with assessment to think about points of commonality and or differences in our efforts to support student learning. So there's many benefits as to really drawing on the instructional tasks that are embedded in those spaces. Next slide, please. And then instructional items. So the instructional item includes evidence to demonstrate students' understanding of the benchmark, and items may highlight one or more parts of the benchmark. And so with the task and then the items, they kind of help to inform many components of this space. So as educators, I think this is actually a wonderful resource where it not only just gives us the objective, it gives us an example of what a task would look like. And it gives us an idea as to how to enact the practice. So it's almost providing almost like a guide for our instructional approaches as we consider ways to support student learning. Next slide, please. All right, so at this time, Sandra, you want to ask the guiding questions? Or no, me, I'll ask them. So at this time, I want you to really think about what did you notice, or what do you wonder, what implication it have? And I'm going to draw your attention, particularly, I'll drop it back in the chat, on page 123 to 125, because we were focusing on the standard MA.912.DP 0.2.4. And so I want you to really look at that standard carefully in the relevant document, because we were using that throughout this presentation thus far. What do you notice? What do you wonder? And what implication it can have on instruction based on what's being defined in the Big M document? What are your thoughts? Okay, so that's fascinating because I'm hearing some very good points, like what Greg acknowledging, and him and Ms. Boss acknowledge, reviewing content that you might not have reviewed before. And some person suggested the need to go think about making sense of where does it fit to my current efforts and having to extend their own learning. But I like how you said it's making it simple, where they're giving you information to help guide your inquiry. And that's important because as teachers try to move things around to make sense of their curriculum, because like Ms. Foster, you're right. When you get used to teaching it and you know it like the back of your hand and they switch it, that requires a different type of prep. That requires a different type of, okay, where does it go? How would that affect my pacing guide? How would that affect what is being assigned? So there's lots of decision that has to be made in your planning. And this is why it's important to review it, to think about what are key pieces that needs to be attended to. That's so, so critical. So next slide, please. So at this time, I mean, one thing I like about the resources too, they highlighted the need for technology. So I am so grateful that Ms. Beth Smith has collaborated with us with this because Texas Instrument have phenomenal resources that can help support meeting these standards. So Beth, you want to share?
So what I want to take and look at is how many of you guys have had a chance just to look at the Big M. So when I know we put that document in there, here we go. But have y'all had a chance to actually spend some time really looking at the layout before tonight?
Put a yes or no in the chat. Just
Yeah,
drop a yes or
no
a
in
no.
the chat. And so I just want to pull this up for just a minute before we have some fun with the TI Inspire and actually do some statistics and maybe learn a little bit and make the connections with the horizontal and vertical alignment. But they really do, like we put that on all the slides, but it really does a nice job of starting with the benchmark and the benchmark clarifications, and then going into the instructional strategies with that, as we had on the slides, and then the misconceptions. And as I was looking at this, is we're going to actually look at this instructional task right now, and how would we do this using technology? And so to me, they do a really nice job of doing really a couple big picture tasks, so that students can or teachers can really get a big feel of how do we do this. And we're going to go a little bit deeper into this, and I'm going to try to do some vertical and horizontal alignment. So a great activity when you're trying to look at bivariate data is the good old cricket chirp. And I mean, this is actually one that you could do with your students, and that crickets chirp, the number of times they chirp per minute has to do with the temperature outside. But in this particular problem, it talks about how they don't chirp if the temperature is below 40 degrees Fahrenheit or above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And so I think this does a great job of bringing into the concept, okay, what we can talk about interpolation and extrapolation, which really is not only in this benchmark, but I'm looking at my notes too. It's also in the 2.6 benchmark. Now, as we're looking at this data, before we really look at the Inspire and we're going to analyze it, the question we would have to ask is, which one of these should be our X value and our Y value? Which is really the input, which is the output, which is the independent, and which is the dependent? So any comments on that, or does it matter? Do you think maybe there's correlation, but is there causation? And so those would be great. You could talk to students about what these different things meant. So which one should we pick? Does it matter in this case? Which one should be our input, our X value, or our horizontal axis, or any comments on that? So would the number of chirps determine what temperature it is, or would it be the other way around? Right.
Cherish text types into note to me, temps as X, and Patty highlighted temps as the independent variable.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to use the TI Inspire for this because I love it. The last 5 years I was in the math classroom, I taught with it, and what it did for student just understanding was absolutely amazing. So I've gone ahead and put the temperature in column A and the chirps in column B. And so what I have here is a list in spreadsheets page. So this truly does function like an Excel spreadsheet. And I know at the fans meeting last week, we were actually having a conversation about how important it is for students to develop an understanding of just spreadsheets and with big data and things of that nature. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert a data and statistics page, or data and statistics page. And so we're going to put the temperature, and I've already played with this, so forgive those other options, the temperature on our x-axis. Now, I know we have a couple elementary teachers, and so this is always going to be, the default is like a dot plot. And so you guys actually would teach this even, so this is where that vertical alignment comes, is that students really kind of have to understand how do you graph data, whether you're doing it by hand and or using the technology. So we have the temperature on our horizontal axis, and then we can come in here and we can put the chirps on the vertical axis. And so now we have our scatter plot, right? Questions or comments? And the kids love to see this, just the whole concept of when it determines that. So we want to determine a line of best fit. And so we'd have to ask the students really, what do they think that is? And I think we definitely need to talk about this point over here, because it may or may not be qualified, so to speak, as an outlier, but what effect could it have on the data? And so we may get to that. So the way we would want to do our line of best fits, we definitely want our students to be plotting these points using paper and pencil, and whether you do the spaghetti model or the pen or whatever you may be. But I think it's also, as Ruthmae mentioned too, that it's important for them to use technology. And so the Inspire is menu and document driven, and don't worry about how I'm doing what I can do, but more, this is what you can do. And so I'm just going to go to menu, and we need to analyze this graph. And we're going to add a movable line so we can play with it. And so this is a line that we can manipulate with the students to try to kind of get that line of best fit. So I can grab it from the middle and move it up and down. And if I grab it from the end, I can turn. And we can try to get a line of best fit, but we're not really sure, like, how do we know what that means? And so I'm going to do some horizontal alignment today, just to kind of get your brains thinking. We ask our students to run a linear regression, but we never really talk about what that really is. What is that line of best fit? Why is it called a least squares regression line? And what I can do here is I can actually show the squares. And so we can talk about this and help ourselves and our students understand that we want that line to go as close to as many points as possible. And the way we determine that is to really look at this vertical distance between the point and the line that we're creating. But if we think about it, if we were to add up all these differences between the lines, some would be above and some would be below. And what would the sum of all those differences add up to be? Since some are below the line and some are above the line. Any ideas? Why do we square it and get the smallest amount of the total area of all those squares added together? Because if we just took the differences, it would end up being 0. Does that make sense? Because we're going to have the same amount of value above the line as we would below the line. And so what's really cool with this activity is they can actually play with it, and we're competitive by nature, and they can see, gosh, how can I really make that sum of squares at the bottom be as small as possible? What do I need to do? How do I need to manipulate that line? And how small can it get? And what effect is that point out there having on how, the least squares regression line? So that's a great opportunity for students to play with it, to kind of get the feel of what that line really means. All right. And then what we can do is I'm going to get rid of my, oops, sorry about that. I got to go back to my menu. And I want to hide those, but we can say, okay, well, this is what we think the equation is, but let's have the calculator calculate that now. And then we can go to menu, analyze, regression. And since we're dealing with algebra, we'll do the MX plus B form, but think about when you get into statistics class, we use the A plus BX, and that makes a lot more sense because A is, it's that initial value. It's often that starting value, or that, it's your y-intercept. And so when I click on this, and so that's pretty good that we could see, like the fit with that. And so what we could do, if students had written down what that sum of squares was, we can now then go compare and show these residuals as well. And so I think I was pretty close. I think I had 7,400 and something as the sum of squares. But questions or comments so far as what this can do to to get this equation, this line of best fit. Do y'all like this visualization for students to kind of get them to understand the why behind just the how? You put it in chat or unmute yourself.
I did this one with my students. They loved it because they could see it.
It's awesome. It's awesome. I love it. Now, so we have that, and then we can even, this is what's awesome too, is we have that regression. We can take this point and we can actually even play with it. And so this gives us the opportunity to, what if that was entered wrong? How would it change that regression equation? Which I think is often also pretty powerful. And then we can do Control Z to undo it. So now I'm going to go ahead and answer, some of the questions with this. It talked about estimating the slope and y-intercept and talking about what they meant. So I'm going to get rid of my least squares line. And we're going to hide that. And I want to go ahead and remove that movable line. And so if we click on this, how do we interpret the slope and y-intercept? We have a y-intercept of -71. What does that mean in context to this? And I did see the chat, any visual examples for geometry. If I have time, I'll pop up my favorite activity for geometry. So kind of in essence of time, because I see we're at 6:48. Does that what does that mean? That when it is -71 degrees, how many chirps are we going to have? Are we going to have any chirps? I'm sorry, I did that wrong. When the temperature is 0 degrees, we're going to have -71 degrees chirps. Does that make any sense whatsoever? And then we can talk. And I think a lot of times that there are many times when we're dealing with something realistic, especially when we have a defined domain, because remember, we're looking at 40 degrees to 100 degrees, when a lot of what we do is kind of like a piecewise function, so to speak, that y-intercept may not make any sense whatsoever. But what about the slope? What does that slope of 3.3 to estimate mean? Comments or questions? So every time the temperature increases 1 degree, how many more chirps per minute are the crickets going to chirp? Okay, yep. So 3.2 chirps for every 1 increase in degree. Okay. And the nice thing about this too is if you really wanted, you can even move and change the window right here. Oops, I have to grab this. Okay, so it really does a nice job of that. And then if I want to go back, I can just do a Control Z and get that back. Now, so the other thing we want to do is moving on is we would want to we ran the linear regression, but what I did not do is show the R value. And I'm going to plead guilty as I forget kind of how to show this R value, but I can come back over here where my data is and this was just a quick, easy way because I forget how to do on the page by itself. So we can talk about that, that correlation coefficient. And I lost it. So let me get that back. There we go. So the correlation coefficient being 0.7, to me, that's not really, really strong. And I mean, it's positive correlation. We can see that, but why do y'all not think it's that strong? What could we maybe do to see the effect of 1 point has on that? And that's what I love about the Inspire. I can click up here and move this. And if we get to where maybe that was a misentered point, look at how that R value changed. So lots of discussions with this. So we know that there's correlation. Is there causation in this effect? So does the temperature, and you kind of can think logically, that's what a lot of that is, that, affect how many chirps per minute the crickets are going to have. And I think we can see as it goes up, the more they're going to chirp. Questions or comments or any added with that time-wise? Anybody have anything to add?
I think this was wonderful that you actually took a task that was in the document and show how would you actually enact it based on the guidance that they offered to facilitate the conversation with the use of technology. And that's important where we think about what are the resources that can help us make sense of it and also help us to ensure that we promote students' learning. So I think it was well articulated, and thank you for your insight. And so there was actually a second part of our presentation. We wanted to make a note of the progression from secondary to post-secondary. And that's important that as they conceptualize the Big M, that was also key to this document as well, for us to really start thinking about pathways forward. And so if you know my comment, I would always say, we don't talk about pipelines, because if we just expect a linear function, it's not realistic. Different students come on at different points, they exit at different points. Nevertheless, our goal is to promote all students succeeding. And so when we think about the pathways to success, there are various pathways. Beth, you want to provide insight into it?
Yeah, sure. So this is based on the FAMS meeting last week down in Altamont Springs, and we were talking about what happens after geometry and algebra 1. And so I just put the snapshot of the 5 courses that would not be for someone necessarily that was on the honors track. And we did have some discussions about algebra 2 and the importance of that. But one thing I just want to piggyback with conversations that we've had with folks at DOE, their whole attitude is that every child should have the opportunity to get on or off a ramp after every grade level. So if you have a student that's in 9th grade that has just now taken algebra 1, that's doing awesome in it, they want that student to have the opportunity to double up and take geometry and algebra 2 in 10th grade. And so they're getting granular, even working with guidance counselors. But for those students, we're not, you've got that algebra 2 option, but if they're not going into algebra 2, we have the college algebra, the college statistics, the college liberal arts. And then there's also this class called Mathematics for Data and Financial Literacy. And folks did have some discussion about that Friday, that we really need to look at what students were going to be putting into this, because whereas it's got awesome stuff with algebra and data and really things like credit and investments, we need to really look at the whole concept with the economic and accounting principles, because some of that can get kind of tough. But just be mindful of that as you're looking at your students. But I think it's amazing that I have 7 states. So to look at what Florida's done with all the different pathways for the students, I'm excited for that. So they definitely have a lot of pathways and lots of opportunities to get on and off ramps.
Thank you, Beth. Now in the chat, I actually dropped the link to the live binder, because if you go to the next slide, the live binder have so many resources to help faculty, instructors, teachers to make sense as to the B.E.S.T standards and, the Big M, and posters, and also training sessions to not just educate you, but also support your department. So I encourage you to just, use the resources available and reflect on how could you support the space. I also want to drop a link in the chat in the essence of time relative to the monthly call. So the state of Florida, they're actually having monthly calls to help educate individuals about the B.E.S.T standards as well. So I'm going to drop the link. So this is a schedule. You want to click to the next slide, please?
Yes.
But I actually put it in Google Drive. So it's one after that. Next slide. Yeah, so it's a link to all the calls. So they have for grade level. So they have the K to 5 meetings, the 6 to 8 meetings, and the 9 to 12 meetings, as well as a leadership meeting, persons who are in higher ed. So they have different meetings for different grade levels. And so I encourage you, if you have a chance, to really take the time and participate so you can actually hear what's happening in real time to educate yourself and be relevant. So you can actually download the link to get insight to the link for the meeting.
I'm really in this. I'm actually an administrator at my school, but I'm the one person who's in charge of helping the teachers figure out what the next step is, because I know math is changing. And I taught math for 24 years until last year. Last year was my first year in administration. So it's really interesting to me, all the changes that are coming about and how math is, when I always think of what I taught in 6th grade math or algebra class, now some of the standards have moved or changed. And I'm just trying to, and I'm enjoying this because I'm getting a lot of the information. I've been typing away here, all the things that I can share with my staff to help them be better prepared with all the changes coming down.
My biggest thing is I haven't got to see any of this stuff yet. And to be able to look at the different benchmarks and kind of see, as a high school teacher, to be able to see what the middle school students would actually come to us already possibly knowing or already kind of seeing, I thought was pretty interesting. I'm super excited about trying to really get to know these standards a lot more. In the past, it's just been like, just tell me what to teach and we'll go on. But I think this one's going to be a little bit more user friendly.
And I'm so glad you said that, because on that live binder, there is a document that identifies those particular standards and maybe where they may be gap, so that the high school teachers or the grade level teachers, as we're talking about the virtual, the vertical alignment, can see where they may be some areas that a teacher may need to go back and reteach, because of the movement, students may not have that particular concept down pat. So that's really, really important, as you said, to just kind of look at the standards and identify, as we're moving, what my students are coming in knowing, what benchmarks should they have already accomplished. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, thank you. We are at the hour. So Math Power Hour has come to a wonderful end. We thank you for your time. We thank you for your engagement. And we also welcome your feedback. Feel free to reach out to myself, Sandra, or Beth with questions, comments, concerns. Our goal is to truly help you succeed, to facilitate effective math teaching, and to use technology to enhance and transform mathematics teaching and learning. Have a great evening, everyone. Stay well and with Build Pride. Good night.